Well, hello everybody and welcome to another episode of the New Ground Life and Leadership Podcast. Today I am really excited and thrilled, privileged and honoured to be joined by Matt Hosier. Matt is based at Gateway Church in Poole, part of New Frontiers, specifically part of the Advanced Apostolic Sphere of Churches. He leads the Advanced UK team and is part of the global team. He's also married to Grace and has 4 grown-up daughters. Matt also writes for the Think Theology blog, particularly on ethical and social issues are some of the things that he's known for, particularly in teaching across New Frontiers over the years. More recently, Matt's been writing about the impact and implications of AI, some politics affecting us all, mental health crisis, and often he's got his finger on the pulse when it comes to things like reproductive ethics and the challenges facing civilizations with the birth gap. Matt, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Jez. Great to be here.
Great to have you. I hope that was a truthful
introduction. I'm feeling good about myself now.
Oh, good. Well, today we've got you on the podcast because you are an expert in our midst, someone that a lot of us read from, listen to, and want to know your thoughts on all sorts of things. And particularly today, we're interested in talking about helping us as Christians and as church leaders develop some kind of working political theory to help us think through and understand how on earth Christians should think about and engage with the politics of our country, and what Christian responses and attitudes should be towards some of the issues to do with polarization, ranging from a whole range of issues like, is there such a thing as a Christian law? If we pass laws that are so-called Christian, does that result in the kingdom of God coming? Those sorts of questions are related to this. Those are the sorts of things that we're looking at. How do we think about this? How do we navigate this? What should we think about Christian nationalism? Loads of questions in my head. And I confess, as I said to you earlier, I don't know anything about any of this. So I'm a real novice. I don't know the right questions to ask. So you're going to have to forgive me for blundering my way through this. But I hope that sounds okay. Are you up for that challenge today?
It's sounding more and more challenging by the second, Jez, but yeah, let's go for it.
Well, why don't we just start by kind of just reflecting on where we are, what's going on in our society at the moment. Some of the things perhaps that you as a pastor who's been in pastoral ministry, senior pastoral ministry for just over 25 years now. And what's some of your reflections on how you think things have just shifted in people's attitudes towards church and state and Christian ethics?
Good question. Well, we've got the big picture stuff in terms of the nation as a whole that as we have very often commented on, as I'm sure people listening to this will be very familiar with, the decline in the basic Christian understanding, people's knowledge of the Bible, of our Christian heritage and culture is ever diminishing, just doesn't exist. So we're a couple of generations now into the post-Christian worldview. Alongside that, there has been the last few years this big resurgence of people drawing attention to the fact that the origins of so much of our assumptions in Western society are rooted in the Christian gospel. So probably Tom Holland is the most famous figure in that whole movement, but others alongside who have pointed to the fact that without Christian values, we wouldn't have the values that we have in the West. And even the values which we have now, which at times might seem antithetical to the gospel, actually in some way are rooted in the gospel. But if it wasn't for Christian ethics, we wouldn't believe in compassion and equality and liberty and freedom of conscience and all those kind of things. So I think that's some of the picture, this complex world in which general understanding of Christianity and Christian ethics is less and less. But at the same time, that is very much the foundation on which our whole Western approach to life is built. And that does make navigating some of this particularly complex, as well as giving great opportunities.
Yes, right. I was reflecting the other day so I read Callum Brown's book, The Battle for Christian Britain, which is a history book detailing the rise of secularism, or the diminishing decline of the church's influence on the moral compass of the country. And I was just reflecting on the idea that in the 70s, much of the church's concern about what they saw was going on was the immorality that was on the rise in the country, particularly when it came to our sexual ethics and our relationships with one another. And that was a big concern, big talk about censorship laws. That was a big part of what it meant to be a Christian nation, was our attitudes towards these things. Those things seem to have declined. The rhetoric around that conversation has turned down, partly because we lost that war, if you like. But it seems that anger is more the pressing issue of our day rather than lust. It's like, well, we lost the battle for sexual ethics. Lust is now rampant. And now actually what we realize is everyone's just really angry at each other, fighting on the internet about things. Like ire has been dialed up to the max and people are exhausted from just feeling a constant sense of frustration. Does that chime with you?
Yeah, I think one of the things I often say is that I think one of the big challenges for us is keeping a sense of proportion and actually having some sense of history, the historical sweep of what has happened in the world over the long haul is really important and really difficult. Even when we're talking about current polarization, which is obviously there, having some kind of historical context is helpful because we think back to the 1930s, we had communists and fascists fighting it out on the streets of the East End of London. And yeah, we've had various street protests and things in the UK over the last few years, but nothing really of that kind of intensity. If you go back to the 17th century, we were engaged in a civil war. So we don't have the same levels of polarization as we did then. I mean, even on the religious front, we're not burning people at the stake, which was happening in the 16th century. So I think some sense of proportion is helpful to actually look at history and say, yeah, that we've got these problems now, but people have experienced similar and worse in the past and navigated their way through. So I think that's part of it. But then the flip side of that is that clearly, obviously, in our context, it is the impact of technology and the way that technology amplifies emotion. So everything gets ratcheted up to a ridiculous degree. The smallest thing becomes a big thing, and that is exhausting. So yes, very much I see that. I feel that myself, and I see that in people I care for. Just a sort of a weariness that the ever echoing echo chamber created by technology has us in. It's an exhausting place to be, and that's reflected in the fact that so few people now bother to actively engage with the news. I mean, I stopped watching. You always used to watch 10 o'clock news. I stopped during COVID. It just got too depressing. And then, of course, the people do get their news from social media channels where it isn't filtered in the same way, and we know the story, we know the spirals. That explains the sense of, I think, there is, and that is detectable. I mean, I see it in all kinds of aspects of life. I think I've noticed it over the last couple of years, even the way that people drive now. It feels to me that people are much more aggressive. People jump red lights much more quickly. They're much more aggressive at roundabouts. I don't think it's just me getting old and more sensitive. I think there is just a sort of relentlessness of the pace of modern society, technologically driven. It does feel that people's fuses are shorter. That's for sure.
That's good. Yeah, and you're right that we have this kind of great accelerant that we're all tapped into or plugged into all the time. That's just constantly fanning these flames. And I know obviously there's conversations about the importance of parenting our social media usage and our internet usage. In fact, you're going to be with us at the Youth Culture Conference in a couple of weeks' time talking about that, which we're looking forward to. I know people often say as well that anger is a masking emotion, and often what's underneath it is fear. And so do you see that actually what's underneath a lot of this frustration is just a fear? And then I guess then we perhaps come to talk about different ways that Christians have tried to answer that or resolve those latent anxieties in people.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can. The fear factor has been the one that's been highlighted a lot recently in some of the big social issues. I think probably I would see it more actually as the inevitable endpoint of our extreme individualization. That when the focus is resolutely on me, then I become very frustrated if anybody thwarts me. So somebody posts something I don't like. How dare they? They're thwarting me. Somebody at the traffic lights gets there ahead of me. How dare they? So I think it's actually. So I'm sure there are some fears. I think sometimes the fear factor has actually been overplayed because again, that can be weaponized. I think a lot of our current issue is much more to do with how far we've pushed down the route of the individual and our lack of communitarian sensibility.
Yeah, it's the challenge, isn't it? That we had this narrative that you can change the world, which is great because it gives you opportunity and a sense of optimism, but it also loads you up with a whole load of pressure that you've got to change the world. And it's about what you can do in the world to make a difference. And if people get in your way, then you feel the pressure to make a difference. Do you think that's part of it as well?
I think we see that with our young people. I'm sure that contributes to the current mental health issues. Is this, if you're being told from the grave that you are a perfect princess and it's all about you and you can be anything you want to do and change the world, and as soon as you face any kind of reality, you find that almost none of that is true. And that's difficult to then process emotionally and psychologically, the reality of life versus what we're told. Yeah, so I think that's a factor certainly amongst the younger generation. But I think that the relentless focus on the individual costs all of us, because it does. We're all less happy. The more we focus on ourselves, the less happy we are. That's just how it is. And what we've been trained in is resolute self-focus, which does make us selfish, does make us fearful, does make us angry, does make us disappointed. Because in the end, if it's all about me, I am going to be perennially disappointed. So that's the I think some of the biggest social background against which we're working.
And so, if part of the problem is a focus on the individual, then part of the answer is going to be a reclaiming of a sense of community identity, which obviously starts with the family, extends to our local community, the church that we're part of. But beyond that, the largest expression of community is the nation or the state that you're part of. Um, and so, just maybe kind of speak into some of the relationship perhaps between family, society and state, church, and then we'll kind of come on to think about how Christians have then thought about how citizens ought to engage with the attitudes and laws of the country they're in, that sort of thing.
Sure, there's some big stuff there, Jez. How do we untangle that? Yeah, so what we're seeing, I mean, clearly we're seeing in many ways a fragmentation of the family. So I think so many of our social woes are traced back to the diminishment of marriage and what that has done across society more generally. We do live in a very strange and very unique time in history. This is the first time that we have more unmarried adults than married adults. That switched a few years ago, and British culture has never been like that. Always the majority of adults have been married. So that's a huge social change, which rarely gets commented on. At the same time, birth rates are plunging, so they're now more over 60s than under 16s, which again is never been how society has previously been structured. That changes things, and it's the more solitary approach to life. So all our towns are being filled up with flats being built, which are 1 or 2 bedroom flats. More and more people living on their own. There isn't the same warp and weft of family relationships as there would have been. And some of that, just you could say, well, certainly for some people, that's freeing, because many families have not been life-giving and oppressive and worse at times. But all these things must be having a profound. They're huge social changes, which I don't think we've really reckoned with. And how can we? Because these are experiments in human living which haven't been engaged in before. And then you have against that the larger cultural issues in terms of all the stuff that's been so much in the news the last year or two, of the migration issues, and then the rise of forms of nationalism, where people seem to be intentionally then wanting to push towards places of identity. This is who we are. And all these things are very tangled up and interrelated and often difficult to disentangle. So, yeah, it's complicated.
And so there is, I think I've heard this before, that there's a link then between hyper or individualization, loneliness, and then a rising sense of the state overreaching. I think Rod Dreher, or work building on Hannah Arendt's work, not that I know much about it, but he talks about the conditions that are required for totalitarianism to take root in a society. And I think there are a number of people who are concerned then, because of the deconstruction of the family, because of all the factors you're saying. Is that part of what we're sensing? We're all nervous because there's a greater expectation on the state to fix things for us, because the family isn't doing what it used to do for us. Is that kind of part of what you're talking about?
Yeah. So I think as we were saying at the beginning, because of our Christian history of our society and what it's created in us in terms of morals, what we often seem to have is a very moralistic culture, and then that gets reflected and amplified in different ways. It might be this morning's news about the campaign to ban 16s from under 16s from social media, or whatever it might be. These are moral concerns, and I think even with the current government, often it seems like the message that comes from government are very, very moralistic, but then don't actually have a firm foundation because they're not really built on anything. So there's this sense of moral rightness, but as soon as it's poked and pushed, it tends to collapse, which makes it very difficult to then create policies which are substantial and rational, and can lead just to sort of uncomfortable, what can feel like uncomfortable posturing. I mean, I think we see that across the political spectrum. It's not just who's in government at the moment. So I think this is a problem when you so one of the things I often quote is the philosopher Nietzsche, who talking about this long before our current issues, but talking about how by removing Christianity, he criticized English philosophers who had tried to remove Christianity but maintain Christian virtues, and he calls them flatheads. And of course, Nietzsche was trying to overturn Christian virtues, but he saw you had to put something else in its place. But you couldn't just keep morality if you don't have the foundation. And I think the problem is we have the trying to keep hold of the morality, but we don't have the foundation, and that means it collapses very fast. And then people would try and run to another moral campaign, but again without foundation, and in the end, none of it really holds together and doesn't make sense. So I think that is the fundamental problem. Without the firm foundation, with no legs to the stool doesn't stand, and that's where we seem to be as a culture. So we're very moralistic as a culture about all kinds of things, but without much foundation for those beliefs.
So do you think it's therefore the job of the church to try to change the moral foundations of a culture? Like, in one of the things you sent me to read before, there's this discussion about the place of the Old Testament law for Christians thinking about how a state should run itself, on what basis it should make moral decisions. Can you start to kind of lead us into that territory then of how Christians have typically then thought about how a nation's moral framework is constructed and those sorts of things?
Yes, I think there's a great nervousness amongst Christians today about legislating Christian values, and part of that reflects even the stuff you're just saying about some of the memories of campaigns in the 70s and 80s, which now we might be a little bit embarrassed by. And because the wider cultural narrative is, well, you do what you like as long as it doesn't harm anybody. Of course, how you define harm is up for grabs. But I think there is this nervousness. And of course, we're not in a position as Christians, because we're such a minority, we're not in a position to legislate for anything anyway, which makes things, puts us in a different position from how it was. But I think if we have what is our vision of society, if we do believe the gospel is true, if we do believe that what Christ brings us into is good eternally and now, that actually the gospel saves us, and that isn't just that you go to heaven when you die, but does save us in terms of how we live now, what we live for, the way that we live, the contribution we make to this earth, how we conduct our relationships, how we build community, what family life looks like, how we care for the weak, how we serve those who are in pain, all those kind of things. If you believe that, then that must be worked out practically, and you draw the line and say, well, that must have some political impact as well. Now, Christians have taken a very broad range of views of how that does work out practically. I think take probably the standout example of the last 20 years was the move towards the approval of same-sex marriage. If you have a fundamental belief that marriage is good and actually is God-given, is to legislate for same-sex marriage is an undermining of the health of society. So there's a gospel belief that runs alongside the belief of actually what is good for people. So you then do get into those very practical issues of how do we vote, what should we be encouraging legislators to do, what do Christian politicians do, all that kind of stuff. which is always complicated, but that you have to if we're going to pray as Jesus taught us, your kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. What would it look like if Jesus actually answered that prayer?
So you're saying part of what it would look like is laws being passed that would uphold things that align with the moral law as handed to us in the Mosaic law, or kind of increased upon by Christ? Is that the sort of thing you're talking about? That if we want your kingdom to come, because there's a tension between the kingdom of God comes inside my heart. I receive Christ as Lord. I can't then impose that on somebody else, that they must live as I live, because it's a decision I've made based on Jesus' lordship. I will have I will only have sex within marriage with one woman who's my wife, but I can't impose that on others because they're not Christians. Why would I expect Christians to live by Christian laws? And that, I think, sometimes is part of the tension that Christians feel when it comes to acting in the world outside the church and outside of their. Maybe it's a problem with our hyper individualism, as you said. But what are some of the attitudes that people have taken on that over the years?
One of the great achievements, I think, of a more Christian culture, as we emerged out of some of the chaos of the religious turmoil of the 16th and 17th centuries and came into the modern era, was the notion of freedom of conscience and what that meant. It's so hard for us to grasp just how religious Western society was 500 years ago. That everybody's life was utterly shaped by religion, for good and for bad. And we live in such a different world now. But the step change which came with the recognition that religious belief could not be coerced, and that each person individually had a right to relate to God as they saw fit. And then when that was translated into actually freedom of expression of worship, so you weren't coerced to worship in a particular place in a particular way, but you could express your worship as you wanted. That was a huge step for human freedom, liberty, and happiness. And that principle of freedom of individual conscience, I think, is absolutely key. And we should not be involved in coercion of conscience. And I would argue that actually freedom of conscience does, in the end, absolutely depend upon understanding. It comes absolutely from a Christian background. That without that, conscience does get coerced, and we see that in radical secular states, most obviously in some of the communist experiments with coercion of conscience. In the dictatorships, that's what's happened in North Korea. There's coercion of conscience, which then has all other kinds of practical manifestations and is horrible, hideous towards human flourishing. So I think we should absolutely, resolutely, unbudgingly stand on freedom of conscience. We can't coerce people's thoughts, but then we still do allow for legislation which puts boundaries around behaviours, and that's at the very practical level of you cannot drive at more than 30 miles per hour in this street because to do so is antisocial and dangerous, or we're going to restrict what you can do in terms of which drugs you're allowed to access because it's bad for your health and bad for society if you have free access to these things. So there's all kinds of things in which we legislate for because we recognize they're in some way necessary for human well-being. You can do that without impinging upon personal conscience. So I might, in personal conscience, think anybody should be free to take heroin if they want to, but understand that actually it's good for society as a whole to prohibit that. And I think a lot of the moral, social issues, there's something of that dynamic in play. So on the marriage one, I think anybody should be able to believe whatever they like about whoever has sex with whoever. But for the health of society, I think it was a terrible mistake to make divorce as easy as it now is and to legislate for same-sex marriage. I think that's done harm to society as a whole. And I think we can argue that on empirical, objective grounds as well as religious ones.
Wow, I mean, you're so good at this, Matt. I love this, and you just throw out so. I mean, everything you're saying, I feel like is is worth stopping and reading an article about and reflecting on. So I really appreciate your just measured, wise responses. That you've clearly thought a lot about this. So forgive me, my questions aren't necessarily polished enough. But so a kind of related question that comes to mind, and then if freedom of conscience is so valuable, and freedom of worship, should Christians be in favour of, say, a country that allows for freedom of people to worship false gods, say? The blending of, well, in the Israelite theocracy of the Old Testament, it was strictly forbidden that they would have worship of false idols because of the damage that it did to the country. And yet in a country like ours, we think, it's a mark of our moral health that we can allow for such a diversity of different beliefs on all sorts of things and allow people to worship. But I suppose you're saying as long as it doesn't then impinge on some of the more kind of harm-related issues of behavioural constraint. Talk to me about how this relates to worship of other ideas.
So we're getting to very deep waters here. I find myself getting cancelled if I hadn't already been cancelled in so many ways. So I think the experiment in multiculturalism, which is really what we've engaged in over the last decades in our context, and sort of simplifying and stereotyping in a way which isn't necessarily helpful, but just for the sake of the discussion, is to say that every culture is equally valid. There's no superior one culture, one religion is as good as any other, and it really doesn't matter. And I think that's a fundamentally flawed approach. So I would want to argue for the individual and community's rights to express worship however and to whoever they want. And clearly in our multi-cultural society, multi-ethnic society, that people from many different kind of communities and backgrounds who do have different religious frameworks and histories and would want to honor that. So I don't think there should be any restrictions on people worshipping in that way. But, and this is where you get into big trouble and can easily be misheard, if you do think, well, actually, that's not quite true. So I'm a Christian. I think Christianity is not only superior to other worldviews and beliefs. I think actually it's true, and other worldviews and beliefs are false, even though there might be things which are commendable in other religious worldviews and beliefs. And there might be things in which we can work alongside other religious communities and all that stuff. Yes to all that stuff. But bottom line, I think Christianity is true. I think other religions are false. So so in the end, I think also that means I think Christianity is better for society at large than other worldviews and other beliefs. So what do we promote? In our schools, should every religion and worldview be treated equally, or should we prioritize one over the other? And if we say we should prioritize one over the other, how do you then do that in a way which still manages to honor the dignity of people from other backgrounds and beliefs and personal freedom of conscience, while not prejudicing against what you actually believe to be true and right? That's the complexity of living in a society which is not homogenous, but has a wide variety of beliefs in it. So that's some of the challenge. So it comes to very practical things. Do we want to get into this? The construction of mosques in our cities. Should Muslim communities be free to gather and worship as they see fit? Absolutely. Should we give? But when it comes to actually handing over buildings for use, should we be less enthusiastic about that than we would for using those buildings for other purposes? That's the kind of very practical questions, which I think are very, very difficult ones to really walk through in a way which is gracious and effective.
I guess the part of the question that I wonder behind that is who is the we? Who are the we? And what do the we want when it comes to these things? Because maybe it's just because I grew up in a non-Christian home, became a Christian in the late 90s. And the church has always been, in my experience growing up, was a marginalized, overlooked, irrelevant, awkward, outdated institution. And then I became a Christian and I thought, oh no, look what I'm now a part of. But from my mindset, my attitude then towards the church is, well, we aren't in a Christian country. These people who represent me aren't Christians. Actually, I resonate much more closely with the early church that says, no, our job is actually just try to live alternatively to the state around us and not expect the state to behave to behave in Christian ways. And I resonate then with the idea that, well, Jesus didn't come to set up a country. He didn't come to create nations. He came to create, or he literally created small bands of followers of this alternative kingdom, this alternative way of being. And so that's where I really struggle to know, like, should I even not even care? Care's the wrong word, 'cause I feel like I know I should care. But I'm like, well, no, I think my allegiance is to Jesus. And actually, a lot of us as Protestants, we take our identity from the fact that we are a beleaguered minority, kind of holding on to a kind of a pietistic faith of trying to just trust Jesus and prove him in a pagan culture. And so the we, as I understand, is, well, the we are pagans. And so my job is to just let the pagans do what the pagans do. But this is where I feel like I kind of almost can hear what you're going to say, that the challenge on, but if I care about the common good, then I should care. Help me to get from my kind of, I'm just in the corner as a Christian having my worship times, and then I should step forward and care about society.
Yeah, I think on all these things are dangerous. We can go to extreme positions in a sense, which is always the problem. So, yeah, you can. There's definitely a danger. We've seen multiple examples of this where people have put their hope in the end in politics rather than in Christ. And the truth is, as you're saying, wherever you live, whatever time in history and whatever context culturally you live in, the call is to be faithful disciples of Jesus, and that's what we do. And to put your hope in politics is a huge mistake. But I think the flip side of that is that we can almost have a sort of it's almost a luxury belief, because we do live in a society which still is remarkably free, where we do have extraordinary privileges. And so we can easily say, oh, it doesn't really matter, just get on with what you're doing. I think where would you rather live, in the UK or North Korea? Who wants to live in a society like North Korea? Now, are Christians faithfully following Jesus and being disciples in North Korea? Yes, they are, and they're paying a huge cost for that. And will their reward in heaven be much greater than mine will? I'm sure it will, because, yeah, they're really working out the gospel. But do you want North Korea to stay looking like North Korea? Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Does it look like North Korea? No. So there's got to be hope for some sort of cultural change in order that human beings can live and flourish in a way that does more thoroughly reflect something of what the kingdom of God looks like. And that's why I'm so grateful that I live where I do in the time that I do. I think part of our problem is we complain so much. It's very easy for us to think of all the things which aren't working as we'd like them to. But there's almost nowhere else in the world or any time of history I'd rather live in now, just from a very practical perspective, in terms of the freedoms I have and the opportunities I have. And so wanting to protect that, I think there's some value in wanting to protect what is good and to see more good, more yeast working through the dough in terms of what society can look like. I've just become a grandfather. I don't want my granddaughter living in a totalitarian state. I wanted to enjoy the same kind of freedoms that I have. And I think that does flow from out of Christian conviction and Christian practice. If we're to be salt and light, if we're to salt society, that must involve some kind of cultural work.
Yes. Yeah. And I think obviously Jeremiah's prophetic statement to seek the good of the city, I think what you're talking about is, when it comes to seeking the good and trying to implement laws that help the common good, and if we believe that God has spoken in the scriptures and revealed his moral law to us through Christ, and then actually we should care about the common good by trying to help them to see the kingdom of God come on earth as in heaven. I completely agree. Would much rather live in England than North Korea and be a Christian and work that out. And actually, if you're in Pakistan, where you're a Christian, and it's not quite as oppressive as the totalitarian regime of North Korea, but it's still very hard. What do you want? You want greater tolerance of your religion so that you can worship freely. And then over time, I guess you're going to want to change the laws of the country to line up more closely with the truth as we see it that Jesus gave us. Is there such a thing then as a Christian country? The concerns of some people who go on popular marches in our country to make England Christian again. Was there ever a Christian country in English history? What do we even mean when we say Christian country? What do you, as a pastor, how would you speak into that conversation?
Yeah, so
I am just aiming to get you cancelled. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, something I feel a bit torn about. I think in some sense you can't. Christian countries, Christian anything is in a sense impossible because individuals, men and women, are Christians. But clearly we can see institutions and societies and whole nations which are shaped by Christianity and what that produces. And I think the arguments that Tom Holland and others have made are very strong, very convincing, that really the things that we benefit from in our cultural moment really do have their origins in Christian belief. Christian belief produced outcomes which made life better for people like you and me. And so in that sense, yes, we should be looking for Christian influence in terms of how society operates. Yeah, so I'm not sure you can have a Christian nation, but you can certainly have nations which are shaped by Christianity and then reflect that in terms of how they dignify human life.
And then how do we decide what that looks like on the ground? Because that's where I think people have. Part of the challenge I find in all these things is that there are Christians on both sides of every moral issue that we come across. And again, Callum Brown makes this point that the reason we lost the culture wars in the 70s was because the church couldn't agree. Should we make abortion legal or keep it illegal? They just couldn't agree. So they fought amongst themselves. And that's where it becomes very hard because there are Christian impulses that pull us in both directions. And so how do you help? How do I think about those things?
Yeah, I think this is where it gets very complicated. So take it out of the sexual ethics stuff, or abortion stuff. Think about approaches to poverty. So a concern, I think we'd agree that Christians should be concerned about poverty. That's very clear throughout the Bible, throughout the Gospels, teachings of Jesus, that we're to care about the poor. Then it becomes practical. How do you do that? And then, in a sense, it becomes political, because you could take a more left-wing approach, which would look at redistribution of wealth and all that kind of stuff, and high, as we currently have in the UK, very high. Massive proportion of our British budget, UK budget, going into social services and all that kind of stuff. And then you might have a more conservative approach, which would say, well, we care about the poor as well, but actually the best way to help the poor is by not through benefits, not through redistribution of wealth, but it's through tough love. It's through getting people out to work and all those kind of things. So you got two very contrasting political approaches, but agreed about the fundamental problem. The problem is poverty. So that's always going to be the case on any of these issues. There will be different perspectives on how to fix it. I think the thing is that we agreed that poverty is bad. Now, where does that come from? That's a Christian moral, because in many societies historically, it's just how it is. And I mean, even as Jesus said, the poor you'll always have amongst you. That's just how it is. And does it matter? It doesn't. Why should I care? Why at all should I care? I've got a comfortable house and a comfortable income. I've got good health. Why should it bother me at all if somebody else is struggling, if somebody's sleeping in the gutter? It's not my problem. But as a Christian, it's very much my problem. Uh, but then how I think about how to fix that might be different from how you think we should fix that, but we both think it needs to be fixed. So I think there's something of that dynamic at play, and I think that's part of the issue, that because Christianity is so ingrained in our culture, we assume the moral position. So we just assume, of course, people think there shouldn't be poverty, but that's not a given at all. That comes from Christian values. So it's that kind of thing I think I'd want to push on and say, okay, then we need to work out how we do that. But the reason that we think this is a problem is because we're Christians.
But yeah, I suppose, would you then advocate that the importance is that as Christians we need to learn to dialogue well and hold our views not lightly, but hold our views as open-handedly as we can. That we need to be open to reason, open to change. I suppose the kind of the figure lurking behind a lot of these conversations is Tommy Robinson and the recent rise. The flags on our lampposts. That's the reason for the conversation, really, is like, so what should we do about those things as Christians? Should we go on those marches? I've listened to a lot of what Tommy's had to say, and I guess he would say that his major concern is with the Islamification of the country, but the majority of people who think about Tommy Robinson don't think of him as being that. They think of him as being just quite nationalistic and anti-immigration and racist. Whether that's fair or not, I think those are how he wants to view himself and his mission versus how people perceive him and his mission. And increasingly, Christianity is getting co-opted, shall we say, by that movement as being something that it's trying to support and make England great again, or Christian again. And so, yeah, I'd like to get your just comments on what you're seeing there and how you think people in ministry and churches should respond.
Yeah, so I think for me the fundamental problem of what's been represented there is it seems that there's a co-option of Christian symbols in order to support another narrative. So it's coming at it the wrong way round. So rather than submitting to the cross and then seeing how that works out, it's co-opting the cross to support a particular agenda. And for me, that's the problem of what's happening there. And that's always a problem when what the thing we actually care most about is our national identity, and then we co-opt religion to support that. That's putting the cart before the horse. So I think that's a problem. I mean, at the same time, I do think we need to listen to some of the concerns which are genuine. I mean, I heard. Again, do I want to go into this? I think it's very easy for those of us who are not living in areas which have become dominated by a particular branch of Islam to think this isn't an issue, whereas for those who do live closer to those communities, clearly it can be more of an issue in terms of what life feels like and looks like. And I think we can be quick to dismiss people on both ends, depending on where our personal political view is. So there's an awful lot which make me feel very uncomfortable, very unhappy with in terms of the Tommy Robinson type of stance. But I think there are some issues there which we need to hear the concerns of communities that are being affected by some of the issues that are being raised, and these things are real. I mean, the rape grooming gangs scandal. I mean, it is utterly appalling, and didn't get anything like the attention it should have got, and that does seem to have been driven often by misplaced fears about crossing cultural boundaries. And so there are problems here which are real. And if you live in one of those communities which has been affected by the grooming gang scandals, you are going to feel justifiably furious about what has happened and how neglected it was by the political class. So I think we need to hear that.
Yeah, and perhaps for those in the political class, if we talk about the cart before the horse, I think the overemphasis of diversity as a virtue and as a value is kind of then just, run to an nth degree. We don't criticize, we celebrate all difference rather than bringing enough scrutiny. But then I suppose a lot of those communities have experienced a lot of prejudice and alienation, hostility from the indigenous populations when they've come. So you can understand because again, there's both impulses trying to be at play. I think perhaps what's needed is just the ability to admit mistakes, admit biases, and work harder to, I don't know, bring about lasting change in those communities and listen. But yeah, this is where the internet doesn't help, because it does just accelerate the animosity between the groups. Also, I guess one of my questions then is how, when we're told to pray for those in power and those who are ruling, how much as Christians should we be animated by this? What place, if any, or if much at all, is activism should it take in a Christian's life? Whether this march or other marches, lobbying governments, how worked up and impassioned about this sort of thing should we get? Because again, it can become very easy for Christians to just be known for their moral position on something. We are anti this and anti that because we know we care about the common good and the good of this or whatever. What's your reflections on activism and you're taking moral stances as churches, preaching into it from the pulpit, those sorts of things?
Yeah, and I think it's something of a litmus test for me about how we do speak about those in authority. And this comes back to where we started with the polarization issues. And of course, these things have all been worse in the States. My friends in the States have gone through terrible times the last 5 or 6 years with the polarization, and where it's become evident that people's political affiliation actually does trump, use that word inadvertently, does trump their Christian convictions. So what you think about Trump does seem in the end to trump what you think about Jesus, which is terrible. And one of the things I always say to my congregation when it comes up to election times is that we need to be praying for those who are in authority, and we need to speak well of those who are in authority. And I think that is that seems to be what Scripture tells us to do, and that's a huge challenge because we live in a society where speaking respectfully of anybody actually is unusual, and the general tone towards those in authority is extremely dismissive and critical, and we just slip into that very easily. So, yeah, there's certainly politicians who I don't much like. I don't like certainly in terms of what they do and what they're producing. So it's a test of my heart. Can I still honor them and pray for them, which I think we need to be able to do. And if we can do that, it does lower the temperature. Certainly in our churches, it should lower the temperature in terms of political polarization, because I really don't like them. I really don't like that policy, but I'm going to honor them and pray for them because that's what Scripture exhorts me to do. And I think that's a very practical discipleship challenge for us in our churches, because I see it all the time. You see it on church members' Facebook posts saying all kinds of things. Why are you saying that? You're a follower of Jesus. We're meant to respect people, honor people, love people. That's a very practical discipleship challenge.
Very good. Kind of a related question, but what should we think about nationhood? And is it a biblical concept? Does God recognize nation states? Should we care about England, or should we actually just care and try to work for the good of the planet, and so be more of a globalist? When it comes to it, often migration's one of the key things in this issue. Like, should we be trying to put a cap on migration in order to care for the people who come under this sovereignty that we call England, or should we actually be trying to share our resources as much as we can with them? That may be slightly off, not as related as I thought, but I'd just love to get your thoughts. So when a political leader says, I want to buy that country, or I think we should own that country, which has happened throughout history, to name no names, but it's happened throughout history, and obviously we're seeing it with Russia trying to take Ukraine, has been trying for a long time now. Obviously we care for the individuals in those countries, but what from your perspective, does God even recognize nation states? And what should we think about those sorts of things?
I think from the biblical narrative, you can see that God clearly recognizes nations. Bibles normally talk about peoples when it talks about that. So these are ethnically defined groups, and clearly God cares about them because there's so much about the nations throughout Scripture. And right on the last page, that people from every tribe and nation will be gathered before the throne. So I think, yes, God cares about nations. The nation state then is different from that, because that involves lines drawn on a map, and often those lines are arbitrary and they always shift. And no nation state's lines remain constant, never have, never will. Even for us as an island nation, we've had different nations within the UK. Our borders have shifted internally. Where the border
We used
between
to
England
own
and
half
Scotland.
of France. Yeah.
Yeah, we used to own a lot of France. We should go and take it back.
Yeah.
So those things shift. So I don't think that you can say that that the nation state has the same biblical status as nations, which talk about people groups. But clearly, what we see in Acts, God's determined particular places and times for people in which they shall live. And so I think there is something you can say about the nation state. Nation states can be honourable. The nation state has come in for a lot of criticism over recent decades, but I think there are a lot of benefits to the nation state in terms of what it creates of community identity, of the rule of law, of care for populations. I think all those things are benefits of the nation state. And ideally, nation states work with other nation states for the good of humanity as a whole. Obviously, sadly, that often hasn't happened, and we result in war and conflict. But yeah, one of the miracles of the last 70 years in Europe has been that nation states have worked together, and there has been peace, and that's been an amazing privilege to live in a society which hasn't experienced war in the way that so many of our ancestors did, kind of routinely. So yeah, so I think there's a lot which can be commendable about the nation state, and then if you recognise the nation state, you do have to protect it. And the question of migration, obviously, a very vexed one, but it does seem to me to have been seems to be a mistake if you allow people who have a significant number of people who have very different moral views, worldview into your society without any expectation that they will adjust those views. That does seem to be asking for trouble, and we see some of that. I mean, if you take it out of the UK, look at Sweden. So Sweden had a very open door, and now Stockholm, the levels of gang violence, grenade attacks in parts of Stockholm, in what has traditionally been a very peaceful society, are absolutely shocking. And that does seem to be largely due to people from a different religious context coming in and bringing their culture in and not adjusting their culture. Now, even in that, we of course see opportunities for the gospel. So, got friends in Stockholm who are building churches, beautiful people from many different nations, people from all kinds of different backgrounds, finding Christ, getting saved. And so you can say, well, God works even in that. So again, as Christians, we always believe in the power of the gospel to bring transformation. There's always opportunity. North Korea, there's gospel opportunity. Stockholm with Somali gangs, there's gospel opportunity. But for society as a whole, is it wise to import a whole different culture without expecting that culture to adjust itself to the indigenous culture? Probably not. So that would be my hopefully somewhat nuanced position.
I mean, it's great. I mean, you partly freaked me out now because I'm due to go to Stockholm to run a marathon in a few months' time. So
Excellent.
now I'm just thinking about that.
I'm sure you'll be fine.
What? So I know this is I guess an issue, a question that Christians would differ on, and I know it's a conversation in itself. But you said a nation has the right to defend itself, which then asks the question: the identity of the Christian citizen as it comes to his allegiance to Christ versus the state. Should a Christian ever fight in the army and take a life to defend his state? When Christ is quite clear in the first 300 years of the church, we're quite clear that's never acceptable under any circumstances. And even when under Constantine, Augustine draws up the kind of development of the just war theory, even then it's very restrictive, and there needs to be very fine conditions for Christians to feel freedom to serve in a war or fight in a war. So there's that issue, and there's probably other issues related to it when it comes to
that small issue.
That issue, and when a state mandates that a Christian does something that violates his or her conscience, like from the very opposite end of the spectrum, wearing a lanyard that supports an ideology that you don't agree with as a Christian. Do you say, well, I'm a servant of the state and the state's told me to wear this and that's what I do? Right through to the issue about can Christians serve in the army? What are some of your comments on helping Christians think through those questions?
Gosh. Well, let me give you a local example. So in Bournemouth, our abortion clinic here in Bournemouth, there was an exclusion zone put around it so that you could not pray in within a couple hundred yards of the abortion clinic, which I think is an extraordinary affront upon freedom of conscience. So actually, technically, if you walked past the abortion clinic in working hours and were praying silently in your head, you would be breaking the law. And that seems to me to be a huge problem. And there have been a couple of people who've been arrested for standing silently near to the abortion clinic and praying in their head.
Sorry, can I
That's an
just answer
interesting.
on that question? Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but that I think is a really interesting question, because do you think in a situation like that, Christians who go outside abortion clinics to pray, they are deliberately provoking or antagonizing the state, it seems?
Well, that was going to be
And
my next
sorry,
statement. So,
go on.
so the guy who got the most publicity about it, I think he was mistaken in a sense, because it did feel like he was being intentionally provocative. So he was just standing. He wasn't saying anything, didn't have any signs, simply standing. When he was challenged by the police, "Are you praying?" "Yes, I am." Now, there was an opportunity for him to walk away, but he chose to stand his ground. He deliberately looked to put himself in that place where he would be arrested and heavily. And I can't remember how much it was, but it was a huge fine, and really, in that sense, quite outrageous. So that's the knife edge. A few of us talked about our pastors in town and say, well, should we take 2,000 people and just stand there silently praying, and by weight of numbers make it impossible for them to arrest us all? And there'd be a sense in which I think that you could argue that would be a valid thing to do on freedom of conscience grounds. But in terms of causing angst and provocation, I can't say the word. Being provoking. Being provoking, it wouldn't be a wise thing to do at all. And I think that's a very real, practical, ethical issue. So I think it's absolutely outrageous that you're not allowed to stand and silently pray. There are streets in Bournemouth I can't walk down and pray without breaking the law. That is outrageous. But should I go out and stand outside the abortion clinic, obviously praying silently in my head to make a point? I don't think that's helpful. So that's something of the tension and the balance on some of those issues. On the lanyard one, I mean, it seems to have gone away a little bit. The whole LGBT stuff seems to be on the retreat a little bit, doesn't it? But a few years back, I know that was a big issue for a whole number of people in our church, and all the NHS workers were given the rainbow lanyard and the rest. And I think that's an example of not just being told you can't do something, but something being imposed. And that seems to be where the step into somebody's freedom of conscience crosses a line. At that point, I think a Christian should be free to say, no, I'm not going to wear that, because to ask me to wear that is imposing upon my freedom of conscience. But as a Christian, if you're to do that, you have to be willing to bear the consequence. So you have to do that being willing to be penalized because of your decision. And that is the discipleship cost. And that would be the same principle for the different issue of pacifism. I think there are very strong arguments for pacifism. I'm not quite there. I often get very close to it and then back off. But if you're going to take a pacifist position, you have to be prepared to bear the consequences of that and say, I'm not going to kill, but I am prepared to take the consequences of that, which means that if the state then chooses to imprison me, so be it. We're quits. My freedom of conscience is not compromised, and your principle of law is not compromised. That's the reality of the cost of being a Christian.
Yeah, that is. And so you think it's partly just being willing to bear the cost of being punished for trying to do good. So another example would be just a state school's teacher being asked to teach something that they don't believe. Should the Christian in that instance say, well, in my role as a teacher, I'm here to serve the state. I'm employed by the state. And so if the state wants me to say that sex between a man and a man is as valid as marriage between a man and a man is as valid as a marriage between a man and a woman, the state's asked me to say that. I'm their mouthpiece in this instance. I just have to do that. And the way that I can do that as a Christian is I don't know, I look for other opportunities to put my perspective across. Or do you say, well, I can't ever work in the state system then, because the relationship between the Christian being citizens of two cities or kingdoms, the kingdom of man, the kingdom of God. What are some of your reflections on that?
Yeah, I think, again, often it can be a matter of approach. So my wife high school teacher. She just finished teaching a year or two ago to work more, be able to serve alongside me in church life more. But a few years back, she had this in her school, which is a boys' school, and they had a staff training day, and there was a local activist group that came in to talk about trans issues, and this was just as all that was starting to become very on trend and very much the issue, and basically a very aggressive line in terms of you got to allow space for, if these boys want to be girls, you've got to allow that. That was basically a very pro-trans teaching. And there was another Christian in the staff room who objected in the moment and was right in terms of his moral objections, but probably his approach wasn't helpful. And then Grace didn't object in the moment in the same way, but then she muscled up in terms of her response, and I was able to help her and coach her in that, in terms of how she then engaged senior leadership in the school, talked about some of the practical problems of what was being taught, highlighted the issues with the activist group themselves who'd actually been recruited. And part of the issue here was just the government says you've got to have teachers have got to be taught on these issues. Teachers haven't got any time to think about it. They just look at a list of who can deliver this teaching. They get somebody in. It's just, these things happen by accident as much as by design. But by being gracious, loving, clear, firm, Grace was actually able to shift the policy of the school and avoid some of the mess that they were heading for. And I think often that's the innocent as doves and as shrewd as serpents, difficult to do, but that's what, in these issues, that's what we need to be. So if you go in provocatively, it does not tend to get a good response. That doesn't mean, though, that you just back off and don't do anything and go with the flow. It means that you look for ways to engage intelligently, clearly, graciously, and that's more likely to get a good response. But sometimes that won't, and you have to be prepared to pay the consequence. So, but Grace was prepared to pay the consequence, actually, if this meant that she had, in effect, come under discipline in the school. She was willing to accept that, but it didn't come to that. Managed to see a change in the school's approach.
That's brilliant. That's really helpful. I was thinking of that same scripture. I often think of that with people: be innocent as doves, wise as serpents, in the way that we live. Well, I know we're kind of coming into land. I appreciate I've put you through your paces, hopefully, with some of these questions, but you're just very, very measured and thoughtful in your responses. I guess a couple of questions. One, just on a kind of practical in the home question. Then, so since we're talking about a lot of these issues, you can't avoid the world's agenda and ideology being pushed at you through the TV shows that you watch, and often then as parents you're watching these things with your children. And initially my attitude as a parent was to ridicule it and mock it as it came on the TV and point it out and kind of get annoyed at it. And so I thought, actually, how do we do this to actually acknowledge what's happening on screen? You don't need to poo-poo it and rubbish it. God created people to love one another. We can celebrate that, but trying to find the wise way to help parents talk to their children about these things in a way that also prepares the children to live in a state that, in a lot of its attitudes towards these things, is post-Christian. So I just kind of would appreciate any comments on that, on parenting and navigating these things in your home.
I think one of the wisest pieces of parenting advice I ever heard was when Grace and I were just married and just started in church ministry, and the church we were in at what's now New Community Church in Sidcup, one of the elders there at the time, it was a parenting evening, and he talked about how, and this shows how different things were 30 years ago. No internet, no mobile phones, how fast things have changed. He talked about walking along the street and seeing page 3 of The Sun lying on the street, and one of his young kids going, "Oh, Daddy, why has that woman got no clothes on?" And saying how the natural response is just kind of an embarrassed, walking past, ignore it, blah, blah, blah. But rather than doing that, actively choosing to engage with the child about what is happening and to explain in an age-appropriate way why that picture is in the newspaper, why people want to see it, and why we as Christians would have a different approach. And I think that's been, for me, very shaping approach that generally it's not helpful to do that response to the things we don't like. It's much more helpful to approach it that way, which is difficult, but to be able to say, okay, you've seen this is going on, now let's talk about it and help you to understand why people are doing this and help you to understand why we don't do that, and how you can think about that. And we've had to navigate that. All our kids are now grown up, but throughout school, what do you do? What do you do with the best teacher in the school who's in a same-sex relationship? How do you explain that to your kids? And and more frequently in recent years with kids with parents with younger kids in schools now, how do you handle it when the 6-year-old in the class is identifying as a member of the opposite sex? And so you can't just go and ignore it. You've got to engage. So it's much more effort, but doing that produces much better results.
That's great. And so many of these things, we want a law to just tell us what to do, but actually we've got to be guided by the Spirit, and as you say, but so much throughout this, our own conscience as well, in how to talk to our children about it. I try to understand and discern the Christian impulses and instincts on both sides of the conversation. Well, Matt, I've loved this. I could talk to you forever. You're just, I'm going to come to Gateway Church Pool and just listen to you preach. It must be brilliant. Oh, and I did have a question. We'll go with this question as the last question. I was going to ask you reflections on the birth gap, but this one I think is probably more helpful for our listeners. As a Christian pastor, preacher, how do you navigate the tension between knowing when to speak into current cultural, political issues and knowing when not to, so that we don't fall foul of the charge of having our agenda shaped by the society that we're in, but neither do we just stick our fingers in our ear and just carry on preaching through whatever book in the Bible we find ourselves in. How do you think about the tension between those two things, and any comments you'd have to share with us as we close on this?
Well, the gospel is political because it is about a king and a kingdom, so that always makes it political. You can't avoid politics. And so if you're proclaiming a king with a kingdom, you're speaking politically. And that means there's always going to be challenge. And that there's always going to be challenge to the individual as well as to society as a large. Where is your allegiance? Who is your king? Who are you serving? And does what you're saying and how you're living line up with where your allegiances say they are or where they should be? So that's always there. I think practically then it can be difficult, and I know I've fallen on the wrong sides of the knife edge both ways many times. I think I tend to, because I do have fairly convinced political convictions, I think probably my public speaking, I tend to push slightly the other way, in a sense not to give the game away in terms of where I stand, and not wanting to alienate those who would have different political positions from myself. Although I think probably if people listen to me long enough and read things I've written, they'd probably work out where I stand in my personal politics. But I would never choose a political party publicly, advocate for a political party up front. So would never do that. But I would speak sometimes into particular issues. And I think it is clearest around some of the moral, sexual, reproductive issues. I think on that there should be far less contention amongst Christians. These things are settled and plain and clear, and often it's just a question of courage that people often haven't spoken about them because they're scared, because it is difficult. And I've felt this. You stand up and talk about trans stuff or LGBT stuff or reproductive stuff, you're always going to offend somebody, and there's so many landmines you can make. It's so easy to say it's saying the right thing but say it the wrong way. And there can be real fear. What happens if somebody puts a clip out of this out on X, and I receive tons of hate mail and all that kind of stuff. So we can feel that. So I think not being party political, not being afraid to speak about the issues, trying to be as winsome as you can be, as gracious as you can in those, but being in the end led by love and trust in Jesus and his grace, rather than being shaped by fearfulness of what the world might say and how people might respond.
Brilliant. Matt, thank you so much for that. Thank you for your wisdom, for the level of time that you've given to think through all of these things to help us as pastors and people in ministry engage with these. As we close, anything on your heart or mind that you kind of want to leave us with, just in passing?
So much. I think I come back to what I said right at the beginning. Fight for a sense of proportion. I think one of the things that has helped me most in these 30 years of ministry was when I really started to get to grips with some church history and to see. I think we often think that what we're dealing with now is more complicated and worse than anything that anybody has previously had to deal with. We're unique in the struggles of our age, and clearly there are things about our context which are unique. Previous generations didn't have to think about the impact of technology in the way that we do. They didn't have those same issues. But if you have a grasp, if you know the history of the Bible, and if you know the history of the church for the last 2,000 years, you can see the ups and the downs, you can see the struggles there have been, you can see how the church has endured, how at times there have been things which have been far worse than what we've gone through. And even in some of the other wider cultural stuff, the Black Death was magnitudes worse than COVID. And just so having some sense of proportion and historical vision helps me not go completely mad. So I would argue people to try and do that. Get to read church history, read the Bible and read church history, and have a confidence in the sovereignty of God. He is out working his plan, and in the end, it's going to be okay.
Amen. Thank you so much, Matt, for joining us today.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Wonderful.